make sure that there were no immediate dangerous flood and health levels of chlorine in the area to help with incident response activities. But it was essentially useless, and certainly within our budget, to try and assimilate all that and boil it down to gas was here, gas wasn't there. And that's why we fell back on the much simpler record of distressed vegetation to show where the chlorine had been, and figured that if we sampled in that area, if it was strong enough to yellow the trees, it was there, and that would be a reasonable first place to start sampling.
Do you find it unusual at all that the data you had reviewed was not compiled?
In reviewing the material that was in the public record, the START report, the Olympus report, they did not in general compile especially the air data that was transient data to monitor the incident and figure out where the airflow was going that particular day or that particular time of day. I don't know that there would have been much to have been gained by trying to go back and sort this out, because the people were no longer in the vicinity when this was happening. So I don't think that that was anything that they had been asked to do or develop, and the data are simply there as part of the record. What is somewhat lacking, and has been a source of frustration, is that there is very little information as to the actual remediation of the site. And as Sylvia mentioned earlier, her understanding was that the hole was 30 feet deep where they dug out the contaminated soil. We searched high and low and called DEQ, Montana DEQ, and talked to a number of people, and we're told it was anywhere between 5 and 15 feet. So as far as we've been able to tell, there are no documents that have been prepared by Montana DEQ, who took over from the EPA as the agency in charge of the cleanup after the initial emergency was taking place, that actually provide what's in engineering terms called an as-built, meaning an actual description of this is the remediation. We dug a hole this deep, this wide across, this long, and describe exactly how that was done. It's mentioned cursorily in the START report and some of the other documents, but we had a very difficult time even figuring out what the depth of the excavation was and where certain samples were taken to confirm that the material had been cleaned up. So that is an area where the documentation is thin.
And it would have been helpful for your work to have.
Would have been very helpful for our work.
I want to mention, in fact, too, that there was some other very minor air sampling done. Again, it's sketchy information. I don't have all the information, and I don't believe it's part of the public record at this point. We did find some reference to 2 air samples being collected on a molecular sieve sorghum media that was subsequently analyzed by Dr. Smith's lab. I have not physically seen the information from those air samples. I believe this happened, and again, this is by pure memory, that they were collected about 8 days after the incident in the vicinity of the spill. Downwind, he was trying to see if there was any migration of the phenolic compounds from the site. Again, I have not seen the data in the actual report itself, but Dr. Smith did indicate that those samples that were, again, this is just a snapshot in time, indicated that at that time, 8 days after the incident, that there did not appear to be any migration of these phenolic compounds. But we're talking, 2 air samples that were collected. And I don't believe that's ever been a part of the public record. That came to light only in conversations I've had with Dr. Smith after the sampling plan had been developed. So there is some cursory information about air contaminants from this incident.
Well, understanding and then appreciation of funding constraints which we placed under I'd encourage you to continue to work with Mr. Humphreys of the ERT, as my office does. And we will be in touch with the EPA to ensure that a full characterization of Alberton is done, covering the immediate areas I touched on earlier.
Well, again, well, one of the issues with the indoor sampling too, I mean, we would not be unwilling to undertake that level of effort. However, that whole situation can be very, very problematic. Again, our incremental approach to this would be to look where we most likely would find these contaminants, which would be outdoor locations. And based on that, then we might go indoors. But there are many compounds that we could come up against when we are sampling the indoor environment. I mean, those are much more uncontrolled environments, and I'm not insinuating that people would purposefully add contamination that might confound our data, but we would have no control whatsoever of the inside of a person's home, and it would be, it'd be very problematic to develop a meaningful indoor air sampling or wipe sampling scheme. It could be undertaken, but it'd be very, very difficult.
Well, I understand that it could well be problematic, but the environmental response team has done that kind of work in different parts of the country. I have full confidence that your team with the ERT can do precisely that kind of work and develop protocols.
It's my understanding that MRL, as they were taking out the contaminated soil, they would go so deep and then do a soil test, and then go deeper and do a soil test. Do you have access to those test results?
There are some soil sampling results that are in both the START report and Olympus's report. However, they're difficult to interpret, at least in one case, and I believe it's the START report. The text refers to the results given in table such and such in the appendix, and then you go to table such and such, and that's not what that is. Typo or whatever, but we had a difficult time interpreting it. Another factor was that there was never any indication of the depth that a sample was taken at. So you're looking at a map that shows dots, and it's difficult to tell whether what they were sampling and whether it was a wall of the excavation or the floor, and what depth the samples were collected at. We spent many hours trying to make some sense out of the information, but it's not presented in a way that makes that very easy. But there were many samples collected. A lot of them were analyzed. I believe they were looking for chloride as an indicator, if I remember correctly. They may have done some pH, and then a smaller subset were actually analyzed for the chlorinated phenols, the acid extractable semi-volatiles. But those analyses are more expensive and also more time-consuming. So you try and do most of your chasing of the contamination using the quicker, cheaper methods, and then finish up with the more difficult, more expensive analysis that takes more time, and use that as your final confirmation. And that's how I would approach a cleanup where I'm chasing contamination.
Can I respond to that air sample?
You wanted to respond to,
The consumer chemistry issue? When you said 50 parts per
please,
million,
and
building look at, and you said a million, a billion.
I don't think what we said was inconsistent, but I think maybe you weren't quite understanding. When they did the excavation of this hole where the chrysolite was, that's when they didn't do canister sampling and look for those chemicals. What she's talking about is when they had a lot of complaints from the citizens about odors still continuing in the community. They went in with canisters and did mercaptan analysis. And she said that the minimum detectable level was 50 ppb parts per billion, and they found none detect. On the way over here, I was reviewing some data from a Summa canister of air samples around a refinery that was giving off a lot of sulfur compounds in some of the mercaptans. And just the chemicals from this material safety data sheet that are included in the chrysalids includes ethyl mercaptan And if you do assume a canister and you use ASTM method, D5504, you can get a minimum detectable level of 5 parts per billion. For the methyl mercaptan, you can get 4. For the butyl mercaptan, you can get 7. And then for the propyl, you can get 6. That's just popping the canister and letting the air go into an evacuated canister. You probably can get higher or lower detection levels if you do putting them on a sieve or things like that. So this is a method off the shelf that most analytical labs do, and these are the detection levels. So at the detection level that the lab is using with those canisters, you wouldn't expect to find it. But that's when the canisters were used in response to the citizens' complaints about the lingering odors in the community, not associated with the excavation.
So to clear the record, we're talking about 2 different periods of time.
Correct.
Right.
And locations.
And locations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You heard well, you may have heard testimony. I don't know if you did. Tell me if you didn't. Earlier today about white dust being observed after the derailment incident. You heard that testimony? Yes. Does your sampling plan take into account the observance of the white dust?
I can respond to that. No, it doesn't. First of all, we were, again, originally asked to only sample soil, and so we were not doing any kind of surface sampling. We hadn't proposed to do that. And second of all, apparently at the time, Olympus Environmental was tasked to sample the white dust and reported that they could not find any to sample. And that's been part of the testimony here today. So if at the time of the derailment there was none to sample, it's difficult to imagine that we can find it 4.5 years later. We'd certainly be willing to oversee collection and analysis of dust, but that was not in our sampling plan.
I understand it's not now in your sampling plan. However, there was testimony today for the record which shows that white dust was observed throughout the community after the derailment incident. It was also observed inside homes, residences, and may still persist in a salvage yard in Alberton, untouched.
Or attics.
Excuse me?
Attics are a great way,
Okay.
place to find it. You can find that in a lot of sites.
Yes, I'm not sure how to comment to that other than that if that is the case, that certainly could be part of the sampling plan. We were not made aware of that situation. We did a very cursory look throughout the community of Alberton when we did have our meeting in June. And I mean, again, we didn't look comprehensively. We spent 15 minutes just looking around and didn't see the evidence of it. We were pointing to some areas where the dust was reported, such as the tennis courts and some of the playground areas, where it was pointed out to us that the dust was there. And when we didn't see that, we didn't pursue it any further. But we have not looked comprehensively for that, nor have we considered that in our sampling plan.
Well, I'm going to recommend that it be included within the sampling plan and that resources be provided to address characterization of any residual white dust in the Alberton community. I'm also going to suggest that in any full characterization done of the community, you also get into satellite imagery, and that the region be asked to work with the EMSL lab out of Las Vegas, Nevada, to do aerial analysis, aerial photography, and other imagery.
Can I make a
Mr. Thomas,
suggestion?
would you like to be recognized?
Yes. Is it possible to have these people do the records review and have Region 8 certify that the stuff that they're using to write the protocol from is correct?
Well, I would like to note the record that earlier testimony offered by Ms. Subra did go to the issue of inconsistencies in the material safety data sheets. And I believe that's a critical issue as we move to full characterization of the Alberton community. So I would expect that as work proceeds, the region be asked to authenticate all such documentation. And I will be recommending that as well.
Sir, your name again, please?
Roger Chalmers.
Thank you.
That's all I have, and I very much thank you for appearing. We're now going to move to folks who have signed up to speak. It's 4:45, and we're going to stay a while longer. I will call your name as your name appears on the sign-up sheet for public comment. And given the number of folks who have signed up, some of whom I've spoken earlier, I'd encourage you to make your statements in 3 to 6 minutes, if possible. And encourage you also to submit the written record, which I will hold open for 30 days after today, anything you want included within the Ombudsman record for this hearing. We have 2 lines and 2 microphones, which we can help point you to. And that being noted, I'd like to start first with Mr. Shooter? Lee? Okay, just to confirm, Mr. Shutter is not here. I know he spoke earlier on the citizens panel. Okay, Ms. Glenda Giles.
May I just spell your name for you, please?
Glenda Giles, G-I-L-E-S. I'm from Eureka, Montana, and I want to thank Mr. Martin and Representative Lookout for giving me some time to speak to you on the record. I want to let you know that I am not a victim of the Alberton spill. I am a victim of another chlorine spill. And I became involved to help the victims. I had no intentions of trying to help MRL or the media, just the victims. I have a prepared statement that I'd like to read to you, and then I have some other information I'd like to share, if that's okay.
Your statement can be made part of the record. We encourage you to synopsize it as much as possible. In the interest of time, please go ahead.
Okay. Basically, it's addressed concerning EPA Region 8 and the Alberton situation. I had, because of my own accident, been involved with Region 8 EPA, at which time I found out that they're not very reliable and they're not very dependable, and they certainly don't try to help a victim. So I wasn't surprised when the people in Alberton complained about the way things were going. By pure coincidence, I spent the night of the train derailment and the chemical spill at a motel located between Missoula and Alberton. Even though I was 20 miles east of the spill site, there was a very strong chlorine odor in the air when I went out to my car at about 10 a.m. At that time, I did not know about the train derailment or the chemical spill. I realize I'm sensitive to the smell of chlorine because of my exposure, but there was sufficient chlorine in the air at that location to cause me to have breathing difficulties, which necessitated the use of my medicated inhaler. In addition, the chlorine also triggered an anxiety attack. And anxiety is well documented as being one of the first symptoms of chlorine exposure. My adult son was with me, and he also said there was a very strong chlorine odor in the air. I later learned that that was the point where they had stopped traffic. That was the edge of the zone. You've heard numerous reports from the victims of how things have been. The reason I got involved, the newspaper accounts that I read stated that Region 8's EPA, OSHA, and other federal agencies were on the scene to help handle this terrible disaster and its effects on the victims. The spill even received brief national TV coverage, and I was confident that it could not be covered up as my own toxic exposure had been. I have since realized that I was very naive back then. About a week after the spill occurred, I read a front-page newspaper article about the train engineer. One of the last paragraphs of the article stated that the engineer and his wife were receiving counseling and just taking things a day at a time because the long-term effects of exposure to chlorine are not known. Immediately, I knew that the victims were being lied to, and I knew that I had to come to Missoula so I could attend one of the public meetings. I wanted to tell the victims what I knew about the long-term damage chlorine can do to the human body and give them official documents with official information on chlorine from the EPA, OSHA, NIOSH, the Chlorine Institute, and other sources. I arrived after the meeting had started, but just in time to hear Region 8 EPA toxicologists tell the victims that if chlorine didn't kill you when you were initially exposed to it, then you would be okay. He told them that chlorine occurs naturally in the body. Therefore, if it doesn't kill you when you're initially exposed to it, your body processes it naturally and eliminates it. And the chlorine causes no further problems. But just because something occurs naturally in the body doesn't mean it is safe to have excessive amounts of it in your body. White blood cells occur naturally in the body, but you get too many of them, you develop leukemia, and you can die. The toxicologist also told the victims they would not have any permanent physical damage to their bodies or any long-term effects on their health. If you believe that official statement, then you better pray that you and the people that you love and care about are never exposed to chlorine. And if you are somehow unfortunate enough to be exposed to chlorine, then you better pray that that toxicologist is not the expert they call in to evaluate you. I spoke to the victims and promised I'd help them as long as they needed me. I'm still helping. The railroad said they'd be there for the long haul, but the victims didn't know what long haul meant to the railroad, because the railroad bailed out years ago. Initially, I thought it was just a chlorine spill, because that's what everybody was saying. But because of my own exposure, I knew that once chlorine had been removed from an area, there was no longer any odor to deal with. Yet 2 weeks after the spill, a pesticide-type odor was still present in Alberton. Several victims commented to my son and I that they could smell the odor in Missoula, and so could we. Victims have told me you can still smell the pesticide odor in Alberton. By itself, chlorine has a very strong odor, but it does not have a pesticide odor. So I realized that some other chemicals had to be involved in the spill. Someone was nice enough to give me a copy of a document labeled Complete Manifest. It listed all the train cars and what they were transporting. It also included hazardous material handling instructions for the hazardous substances on the train, which were listed as 2 cars loaded with hazardous waste sludge, 1 car loaded with butane, 1 car loaded with sodium chlorate, 4 cars loaded with chlorine, 1 car loaded with hydrochloric acid. The only chemical that I knew had spilled was chlorine, but I researched and found copies of newspaper articles that mentioned 1 car had leaked the corrosive liquid sodium hydrochloride, and another car had leaked potassium chrysolate. I knew from my own study of the official documents on chlorine that it is extremely reactive. It reacts violently with many combustible materials and other chemicals, including water. Chlorine reacts vigorously with hydrocarbons, some finely powdered metals, and nitrogen compounds. Also, chlorine is corrosive to most metals in presence of water, and it was raining at the time of the spill. You don't need a PhD in chemistry to realize that chlorine had mixed with other hazardous materials, creating unknown toxic combinations. And while chlorine can be eliminated after a spill, it is very evident that the toxic compounds caused by the mixture of the leaked chlorine with various toxic substances has still not been eliminated from Alberton because it can still be smelled. Dr. Kilburn testified that some of his findings had not been allowed in court. I don't know, I heard one term used by someone that said because they were novel or because they're new. My medical testing was done in California by AMA certified medical tests and by specialists associated with UCLA, USC. The damages, the bad thing is, I guess, and I'm sure the victims feel this as much as I do, is you look normal. You're not in a wheelchair, you don't have crutches, you don't have a cast, you're not using an artificial hand. So you don't look sick to anybody, therefore it's easy for people to say there's nothing wrong with you. When they got through running all the tests they ran on me, they found 23 areas of damage in my brain. My nose, larynx, and pharynx are damaged. My sinuses are damaged. The balance center in my left ear is so damaged it won't test. I have peripheral nerve damage. I have central nervous system damage. I am developing antibodies to my own ganglioside myelin nerve cells. I have optic nerve damage. The muscles that allow your eyes to track simultaneously are damaged, so my eyes jump and they don't track at the same time. I have liver damage. I developed a stress ulcer. My teeth disintegrated. I have mild, deep lung damage. I've developed an asthma-like condition. After the chlorine exposure had so damaged me, I was exposed to some other chemicals in the same environment where I was exposed to the chlorine, which caused me to develop porphyria. Porphyria was thought to be a rare metabolic disorder, but it has been proven over a long period of time that chemicals can cause porphyria. There was a big explosion in, I believe it was in India, where many people were exposed. Those people developed porphyria because of their chemical exposure. Specialists here in the States in '94 started testing their chemically exposed patients for porphyria through the Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Clinic has documented, at this time, I believe they're pushing 90% of the chemically exposed people have developed porphyria. Because of the porphyria I developed, it had such an effect on my system that I developed diabetes. And I had some kidney problems. Every one of these tests was done at a certified AMA medical institution. None of them are novel. The brain damage was documented by first a PET scan, secondly by a SPECT scan. Most of these people have no income, they have no insurance, they have no way to have these tests done. In fact, I didn't have any way, but my son received a substantial amount of money, and he spent that money taking me to California on 2 different trips, and he paid for my medical testing to prove that it wasn't just in my head, and that I wasn't lying about what had happened to me. And I knew that's what they were going to do to these victims. They were going to tell them it's all in your head, you're just imagining it. I'll never forget how I felt when a neurologist looked at me and said, Glenda, you actually have some very serious problems that we can see in our test. I said, you mean it's not all just in my head? He said, it's all in your head because it's your brain. But it's not your mind. You're physically damaged and poisoned. These people have, I'm sure I told you all the symptoms that they've had. Some of those symptoms are embarrassing. When you're an adult, it's hard to tell people that you've lost your bladder control or your bowel control, that you've lost your balance, that you can't tell where the edge of the curb is at night, that you can't see driveways at night. Your whole life changes. I could go outside in a not well-lighted situation and look at from the top of stairs, and all I could see was a ramp. I couldn't see any stairs. I still can't. I've been told not to drive unless I have a licensed driver in the front seat with me because my brain can blip and take me out. One of those blink effects. And I don't want to kill somebody just because I want to be independent. I've lost my independence. I've lost my freedom. I can go nowhere alone. I can't even live alone because I forget to turn off the stove or the iron. I don't remember to eat or to take my medications. I felt like I went into an instant case of Alzheimer's, and I know these people have done that same thing. They deserve a lot of help. They didn't do anything to cause this. They were asleep in their beds and thought they were safe. And all of this got dumped on them, and their lives got changed in minutes. They need all the help that you can give for them. And I plead for them because my heart hurts for them, for the destroyed families and the destroyed lives. And I appreciate you letting me have time to talk.
Thank you. I understand new Mayor Alberton's present, Sandra Tosin. Is she present? She might be in the background. Just wanted to recognize her. Third, we have Harvey. I'm sure I'm not reading it right. Harvey Lou Breton? Harvey, are you present in the room?
Is there a Harvey in the house?
Okay. Tony, Mr. Tony.
Tweedale.
There's an A in there, Dale.
Yeah.
Tweedale.
Sir, would you spell your last name, please?
My name is Tony Tweedale. It's spelled T-W-E-E, D as in Dave, A-L-E. I'm an environmental activist, a toxics researcher. I have certain qualifications at undergraduate college level science, but I don't have a science degree. I do a lot of independent reading and research. And I've been involved in helping Alberton victims since the beginning as best I could. And I'm, as all people, appalled at the absence of DEQ, City County Health Department, and EPA, although it sounds like we may have tried to get here. Ms. Martin, I'm familiar with your work with the WTI incinerator, which is just a horrible situation, and you've done a lot of good there, and I hope that you in the future manage to gain the full support of EPA for your work. Let me first address the sampling issues that were discussed at length, the sampling that's going to be done. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense to do an iterative approach and do more sampling as you find out more. But on the other hand, you have to do screening, wide-based sampling of all sorts of things to find things in the first place. So it's a bit of a balancing act. One of the elements is sampling in tissues, human tissues. I think you have to, based on budget restrictions, you nevertheless have to do some initial sampling of tissues on a screening basis without knowing exactly what you might be looking for as sort of an independent confirmation, because the environmental sampling, there's never going to be a full picture of the traveling of the contaminants from their environmental release through the environment into the bodies. And similarly for the environmental sampling itself, well, I guess the only thing I've mentioned that hasn't been mentioned is that the soil gas sampling, you do want to do screening, a wide-based screening. The original proposal was just to analyze it for, I believe, mercaptans or such compounds. Since you are doing screening, I would recommend that the analysis be paid for to do a wide range of compounds. As an example, like I said, in the soil gas, and perhaps revisit the sampling plan to try to do wide-based screening in general. The Roger Chalmers' recommendation to begin at the beginning and look at the bill of ladings and so forth and try to reconcile that data is excellent. It's going to inform all the subsequent steps. For example, with radionuclides, we know that Idaho National Engineering Lab in Hanford are on the rail line, as it were, that travels through Missoula. And I know it's, you know, simple Geiger counter, as long as it was detecting the right ranges of things, could prove definitively, as long as it was done independently, whether there was a release. As to the dioxin sampling, I'll turn to the audience for a second and say that I collected a sample myself when the rail cars were in Missoula of the cresol tanker, the chlorine tanker, where it impacted the cresol tanker. There was a bunch of sludge on the end there. And gave that to some of the Alberton folks. If anybody in the audience knows where that sample went, that was the heart of the reaction vessel, as it were. This was an exothermic reaction, heat-producing reaction. The EPA Region 8 seems to be a little confused. There were obviously dioxin skeletons formed in the cresol tanker as it was used in the refineries. But the point is they're unchlorinated. They weren't chlorinated until the reaction with the chlorine. As I said, that's an exothermic reaction. The physical venting of the chlorine gas is another factor that could have helped begin to spread the chlorinated organics that were formed. Dr. Smith's testimony this morning was very interesting. There's some subtle factors as to the pH differences as the cresols and the chlorine change state, which would affect their volatility. But there's little doubt that the products were formed. A similar reaction vessel would be the trichlorophenol herbicides, chlorophenoxy herbicides, excuse me, that have dioxin contamination up to 1%, 1 out of every 100 molecules when these herbicides were manufactured was a dioxin molecule. Very similar chemical reaction. So the real question is, how far did they travel? And I want to address that test and talk about it a lot. And the health effects, I want to mention the issue of chloramines. It was mentioned this morning again by Dr. Smith that could be formed on the skin by reaction with chloride ion. It's undisputed that pretty rapidly the chloride, hypochlorous acid and the hypochloric acid that was formed fairly rapidly turned into chloride ion, which is generally regarded as non-toxic. It's certainly prevalent in the body. But I've read some literature, and I'll get a copy of this and submit it. We were talking this morning about the oxidative damage. I've read where chloride ion, with the catalytic action of peroxidase enzymes in the body, converts into various free radicals, oxidative damaging products, and eventually reacting with proteinaceous material in the body. The ultimate product is chloramines. Chloramines are famous mutagens, damage DNA, and are just generally very reactive products associated with mutagenic mechanisms of cancer formation. They're used in water disinfection treatments to kill microbes, but at the same time they're suspected of being harmful byproducts in drinking water chlorination. The other health effect I wanted to talk about was sensitization.
Excuse me, Tony. This lady is only going to be here until 6 o'clock. We have a lot of citizens that are victims that do not have the capability of writing out a written testimony, and you've already stated that you are going to send a written testimony to Mr. Martin. I would ask that you finish up. You've been speaking for 6 minutes now. We need to save time for the victims. Please, finish up, please. Yes, sir?
With all due respect, the attorney is probably the most knowledgeable person in the Northwest about this issue. I would like to hear what he said.
Well, then I might ask you to step out in the hall, because what I've heard him say is the same thing that's been said throughout the day.
Sir, your name, please?
For the record, my name is Will Snodgrass.
I'll try to finish up pretty quick. I certainly never said I'd submit a written statement.
You said you were sending it.
Can I finish? The issue of immune sensitization, long-term sensitization, this is a very important subject that nobody else in the room really knows about. The compounds which set off the basic allergy reaction of the immune system, the immune system reacting to a foreign compound, whether it's a particle, a molecule, a biologic agent, that's called inflammation. And chlorine is a known inflammatory agent. The question is, are there any chronic long-term effects? Part of the immune system's function is, as many people know, to create an antibody to a particular foreign compound so that the next time you're exposed, the immune system reaction against that foreign compound can begin at a lower level of exposure. That's basically how allergies work, and that's why in the field of toxic exposures, sensitization is sometimes known as a chemical allergy. Now, I don't want to say this is the only mechanism at work in toxic exposures, but it is a major mechanism. And I believe that a lot of the symptoms that have been listed today are classic symptoms of having your immune system activated on a chronic basis: joint inflammation, headaches, all this inflammation of neurological tissue, inflammation of muscles, of joints. To me, it all sounds like inflammation, which is the immune system being activated by a subsequent exposure and trying to kill off the foreign agent by releasing cells that lies open, biological cells, free radicals that destroy other compounds, and macrophages which gobble up foreign agents. So that's just a general mechanism by which the Alberton folks can be studied, and there's certainly experts out there who would testify to that effect. So I'm almost done. I certainly do want to hear more victims testify. I'll just finish up by saying I'm insulted by Montana Raillink's quitclaims asking people to sign away all their rights and then leaving those people economically ruined and their health ruined. I've observed personally unsafe tracks that I've reported to the FRA that have been verified, and there have been incidents in the few years after Alberton, especially, not so many quite recently, of basically malfeasance by the MRL in terms of their safety. So anything EPA can do that would help put pressure on MRL would help. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Will Snodgrass.
Thank you, Mr. Martin, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. To give you some idea of how widely this chemistry drifted, I received a phone call at approximately, my name is Will, W-I-L-L, Snodgrass, S-N-O-D-G-R-A-S-S. I received a phone call at approximately 8:30 in the morning of the spill from someone who had learned about it secondhand. I went outside, there was no chemistry in the air, no chlorine. I went out again at about 10, and then again at about 11:30. By about 11:45, that spill chemistry had drifted into the Rattlesnake Valley where I live. I called someone whom I trust, a biology teacher with a degree, I asked him to go outside, and he said, quote unquote, "It is here." His name is Ronald Wheeler. So within a very short period of time, discerning individuals were aware of chemical agents that were in the air, in the Missoula airshed. And so they traveled rather quickly in a very short period of time. Coming back on I-90 a few days later from the dioxin conference in Salem, Oregon, which I had arrived at in a roundabout way because the I-90 was closed, at the St. Regis area, 5 miles west of St. Regis, my face began to burn from the chlorine. And we took the hill up over St. Regis Way, and that chemistry began to dissipate. And then once again coming down Frenchtown Way, down Evero Hill, we were aware of it, as were students on the university campus days after the spill. It was a very surreal scene to realize that there was that much ambient chemistry surrounding us, and people were conducting their lives in a normal fashion. The problem, as I see it here, is that whereas there are good, hardworking people at the lower level of EPA, we have a problem at the upper level. And those people have been variously described by the hardworking scientists and other administrators of the EPA as political doormats or paid professional liars. And I think that the historical record of EPA lies and cover-ups is available. It is a matter of congressional record, and they have been caught lying. And I do know, Mr. Martin, that you, in fact, are doing good work on behalf of citizens. So I want to make it clear that my criticism does not extend universally to all members of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Now, there is an undeniable fact. Toxic, corrosive chemicals were released. And it is fair to say, I think, given the tools of molecular science available to us today, that the life design cannot be subject to toxic chemical exposure without experiencing chemical injury at some level. That is to say, functional damage at the cellular level. And I like to use pictures in my work with children to help them understand what happens to people when they are exposed. So we simply need to crunch some numbers in this low per billion range that's been bandied about here, knowing full and well that functional impairment is known to occur at levels below the odor threshold, whether we're talking about mercaptans or solvents. And to envision the brain as the earth, and just imagine that it is a large growth of leaves and roots and other structures of that nature. Just imagine a small pickup truck driving through it with a flamethrower, gaining entrance to the brain through the olfactory nerves, which is the same route of entrance that chlorine gained entrance into the brain of the Alberton victim. And imagine that truck going around torching areas of tissue. Now you have some picture of the oxidative process. And indeed, were we to attempt to duplicate what the brain can do using the best computer tools today, the machine we wind up with would be approximately the size of the Earth or the Moon. The point being that the brain can sustain considerable damage in many areas of function and still continue to serve a person in order that they might move their arms and legs and appear outwardly normal. But the levels of functional impairment that are taking place are measurable, and if you apply state-of-the-art tools of science to measure the exposed victims, and that would include ELISA testing, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assays, which can find the fingerprints of not only the AIDS virus, but 2,4-D, the pneumoma ELISA testing, qualitative electroencephalograms, SPECT scans, PET scans, positron emission tomography, and porphyrin enzyme panel tests, then you begin to get a more clear picture of what happened to the citizens out in Alberton, Montana. And I would also like to point out something that Dr. Kate Kilburn said a couple of years ago, that it's becoming increasingly difficult to find a normal, healthy population of controls because there is so much ambient chemistry out there. I think that we've had enough of testing protocols that simply kick the tires. And I would say that in Missoula, Montana, where physicians, I think, utterly failed to adequately work up the patients who came, if those same physicians were practicing auto mechanics, their clientele would not be coming back to them because their cars would not be functioning. Clearly, the cars might stop and go. Maybe the windshield wipers didn't work, or the speedometer had a little glitch in it. What does that translate to in terms of diminishment of functionality for a child or an elderly person who is already struggling to make change, for example, in the grocery store? So the mechanisms of these chemical reactions are very well known and very violent at the cellular level. We're talking about atomic chemistry here. This is not 1950. This is the year 2000. And if we imagine a single cell as a city or a large department store or mall, and we crunch these numbers in the low part per billion range and discern what goes up through the nose into the brain and what goes in through the skin and in through the contaminated foodstuffs, etc., we wind up with quadrillions and quadrillions of molecules that are taken in every minute. Now we just apply those numbers to the number of cells that we have in the body, treating those as our department store or our city, and we have assassins running around inside a closed space, getting into the cellular membranes, destroying things at the level of DNA. So let's apply these tools of science to this particular incident, and let's then expand what we learn into the court system. And I can close out here very quickly. My notes have gotten quite small, and there's not very much light for my 50-year-old eyes. EPA sampling methods have proven woefully inadequate, perhaps by design. I would draw your attention to the model for benzene testing. It doesn't work. You can have animals with black urine, apply your test methods, EPA's test methods, and come up with negative findings. But the benzene is there, for example. We know that EPA has indeed falsified test methods. They've altered them and essentially falsified them. They've falsified the results. I'll try to close out here quickly. Again, anecdotally, the spill was in April. In August, about August 11th, I was at the Sear rafting area with 10 or 12 other people. As we were preparing to put the raft in, and that's near the spill area, I noticed that my face began to burn. Very much like it would burn if you were charging a car battery. You were in an enclosed space with a car battery or two that's charging. I began to make my way over to another member of the party to tell that person what I was experiencing. Unbeknownst to me, but I soon realized at the same time that person was experiencing the same thing, coming over to tell me what she had experienced. A couple of months later, a professional electronic engineer, a man who has considerable money, no access to grind, raising a family, called me on the phone and said, if I were driving through the spill area, what might I experience? I said, well, you might sense a very slight, subtle, prickling sensation all over your face that would give you a very eerie feeling. And he said, I can't believe it. He was driving through with his windows open, and that's exactly what he experienced the day before, and that's why he called me. This is a mineral acid we're talking about here, HCl. And according to Dr. Bob Escher, who worked on the Solid Rocket Motor Program and was one of the members of the acid rain team that discovered how acid rain kills trees, it is relatively permanent in nature. In other words, once it's released into the environment, it stays there. I talked to Garen Smith about this morning, and he said, that is not consistent with what I know about HCl, but I'm always open to new information. And I think we need to investigate what indeed might be remaining there in terms of an acidic potential. I was near the man who went onto the sodium cressolate car, Mr. Tweedale. I watched him go get the sample. He did not rub his body on the car, the train car. I didn't see him touch it. I didn't see any wet material getting on his clothing. When he came back to my vehicle, from a distance of about 5 feet away, I could smell that chemistry on his clothing. Having worked around solvents and all kinds of toxic chemicals, I'm here to tell you that I have never, in my experience, smelled something and felt something as utterly toxic as that compound. Although I told him not to get in the car, he did. It took me hours of vacuuming and cleaning to get that out of there. And the coveralls that he had on, although they were wrapped in plastic, for months you could smell them. He sat right in the corner by my fence. So the chemistry, the lists of products that we were told were on that train was related to one of the United States leading experts on dioxin and pesticides, Carol Van Strum in Oregon. She said it sounds like pulp mill waste and/or pesticide waste. There was something on that train about which none of us have been fully informed. And in fact, there was a doctor at the community hospital who says he was treating workers, site workers, who presented with symptoms of pesticide poisoning. He had written 2 letters to MRL. He had gotten no response. He wanted to know what was in that car. With respect to radioactivity, there have been 2 fairly significant rumors circulating about this community about the presence of radioactive materials on that train. And so far, no one has been able to substantiate that. I have a lot more, and I will endeavor to submit some comments in writing. 2 more quick comments. When you talk about susceptible individuals, consider the Tokyo train wreck. Thousands of people were exposed to that nerve agent, but only 12 people died out of all the thousands. Why? Because those 12 people lacked an enzyme necessary to break that chemical down and render it relatively harmless. Again, you cannot undergo a chemical exposure without damage, but some people will be more susceptible to it. Chris Weiss said to me on tape, there was an exothermic reaction out of that site. Yes, there was a fire. That is on videotape. And I guess I'll just close out here by saying that EPA and related agencies at the federal, state, and local levels are all very adept at creating massive piles of paperwork. You see a lot of it out there, while utterly failing to protect citizens from toxic exposures or even warn them adequately. Evidence of this failure is apparent all around us and among us, isn't it? And as Dr. Kilburn has said, again, it may be difficult these days to find a normal population of healthy people. Again, thank you.
Thank you. Daniel J. Young.
Wait, Mr. Martin, she's got to go. She's waited all day. Can you just slip her in real quick?
Sure, please come up. Can you state your name for the record, please?
My name is Lois Johnsen, and I'm here for my husband too. He's only got 25% of his lungs. He can't be around a crowd for fear he will get sick. And then the doctor says if he gets pneumonia or flu or anything, it'll be the end of him. So I'm here for him too. I'd like to say when we first heard about the whole thing, we were asleep in bed, and I heard a crash. What I thought was a lot of times down there across the bridge at Alberton, the train will kind of make a noise and the cars will hit each other, and so I thought that's what it was. Later on, my son called us and told us to get out, that there was a train derailment. And so we hurried up and got dressed. And as we walked out the door, a big cloud of smoke was coming down over the top of the car. My husband inhaled some of it, and so did I. And we just hurried up and we went on into Missoula and to my nephew's place. And while we were in there, I had headaches, and I had pressure on my brain, but I just didn't pay any attention to it. I just thought, oh, it was just a headache. And my husband was into the emergency room 4 times. And then when we finally got home, I could still smell something around the area, and I couldn't figure out what in the world that it was. And then, let's see, I gotta get my notes here. Yeah.
Lois, I'm going to ask you a question while you're finding your notes. What did they do for your husband in the ER room?
They gave him a type of medicine. His airways were collapsing. His airways kept collapsing, and he, before this happened, he could take 5-mile walks with me, and now he can't. And it affected his sex life too, because he can't get excited over anything because his airways keep collapsing on him. And that's what it's done to our family. It just tore us apart. And then when we finally got back home, I was in the kitchen and he wanted me to go to the other end of the house, to the family room, to get something. He told me what it was, and when I got back there, I thought, what's going on? I can't remember what he told me to get. So I walked back into the kitchen and he started bawling me out. He said, well, didn't you get it? And I said, didn't I get what? And this has been a constant problem between him and I because I can't remember things anymore. And I know that it's from the derailment because I had a good memory before that, and that's what shocked me. When I went to the other end of the house, I couldn't remember what I was going for, and I thought, what's going on? I have never been this way before. And so it's just kind of a constant thing between him and I right now. He yells at me because he'll tell me something, and later I can't remember what it was, and he's, well, you should remember, I just got through telling you. And it's been a problem between us. And then about 5 months after we got home, my daughter and my little grandson were out to visit us. We took him down to the Natural Pier Bridge to go fishing. And things were pretty fine. And then all of a sudden the wind started blowing from the way of the derailment. And my little grandson started getting sick and he started vomiting. And my daughter says, what's the matter? And I says, can't you smell something? And she says, yeah, I can. I says, well, that smell wasn't here when we come down here. She says, no, Mom, it wasn't. So we hurried up and packed our things and went back up to the house. And the rest of the year, from those months on, every time the wind blew from that way, my husband and I would have to close our windows because, and I know that it was more than just chlorine. We could smell that it was more than just chlorine smell that was in the air. So it has really damaged our lives. Like I said, it's damaged our sex life. No, these are some other papers. And my husband feels real bad about it, and I do too, but there's nothing we can do about it. Because, like I said, his airways keep collapsing. It damaged his airways real bad. That's about what the derailment has done for us. It has ruined our life. But we got to get on. We know we got to get on with our lives. And we've been together for 52 years now. And I have learned to live with his comments and kind of walk away from him when he gets after me about not remembering things. So that's about how it is. And he's on all kinds of machines now. And now the doctor, this last week, the doctors finally put him on, wants him to have oxygen in the house in case he might need it. It would be there. So he's not going to use it till he has to. But he's on a nebulizer breathing machine now, but he's holding in there. He's hanging in there. But that's what is done to us. And when he told the doctor, this is one thing that made him really upset, when he told the doctor that his airways collapsed, that when he was ready to have sex, his airways collapsed. The doctor laughed at him and told him he just needed to know how to do sex. Yes, that's what the doctor told him. That was pretty nasty, that's what I thought. So,
Well, being a senior citizen myself, these young people don't understand. We never get over sex.
So that's about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Daniel J. Young? Daniel J. Young? Peggy Stevens? Peggy Stevens? Lucinda Hodges, I see, signed up again.
I'm going to pass because I didn't know I was going to be on panel. So let someone else speak who has more turn.
Mark Hansen?
He's left.
Richard Greenlab.
I provided written comments if
That's fine, they'll be accepted for the record. Gail McGregor. Gail McGregor. Tim Vogelberg. Tim Vogelberg. Kurt Connell. Kurt Connell. Larry Mickelson.
Hi, my name's Larry Mickelson. I was a victim at the Alberton spill. I'll try to touch through a few things since we're running short on time. After the spill, we were all evacuated, went through this, and we had the meetings at the Red Lion motor inn. MRL had a doctor by the name of Walter Peschel come and speak to us, I believe on Saturday after the spill. He told us he didn't know much about chlorine prior to that, but in the past 24 hours he's done a lot of studying and reading up on chlorine. He advised us at that meeting by Monday, that following Monday, we'd all feel fine. We were misled many a times in this situation, and that was just another example of it. After we returned home, and we lived on the east side of Petty Creek Road on South Side Road, so we were allowed to return home much earlier than the Alberton people. Petty Creek Road's about 30 feet wide. If you're on the east side of it, it was safe. If you're on the west side of it, it wasn't. I'm not sure how they determined these things, but I don't believe it was ever safe for any of us to go back when we did. When we did go back, my employer, the Montana Department of Highways, put me to work at the roadblock at Petty Creek. Worked from 10 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning. There were many nights that the smell got so bad you couldn't hardly stand it. The Missoula Deputy County Sheriff's Department called for a monitor one night. We never did hear the results on it, but it was very bad that night. I think there's probably some records there that need to be looked at. After everyone returned home, we found that the railroad was doing things that was kind of, strange, like they started spraying pesticides on the railroad track right beside our houses. Such a short time after the spill. Why were they doing this? This was just another incident. We didn't need it that time. We also found from this fire season, smoke had settled in through the valley, and it would clear out at certain days and blow back in. And one thing we noticed this past summer was that smoke did settle in certain areas and stay there when it cleared out in other areas. So it's very possible that we have gases lingering in certain areas and not others. I have here a bag with, and this isn't my pill bag, this is 2 carrots that we took out of our garden. These carrots turned white after the spill when we harvested them. The first year we harvested pretty good sized carrots that it turned white. These come from the second year, and they also turned white. We no longer grow a garden. I have 2 pictures that I will leave with you for the records of these carrots. Other people have discussed, food contamination and so forth, and I think there's something there that needs to be looked at. After they had recovered the derailed cars, they brought them to a siding 6/10 of a mile from our house near Lothrop, where there's many other homes.
they left these damaged open cars with the residue and stuff in them sitting there. There's a huge bullpine tree there right beside that track. It turned it brown. And generally speaking, our wind is from the west in that valley. And we got day after day, the smell, the chlorine, whatever other chemicals were there, was blowed right over our house. Finally, they moved the cars out of there to Missoula, and then they were ordered to move them out of Missoula because of the smell. I think MRL has undoubtedly misled us, and I feel that they really need to be investigated, why things were done the way they were. I want to thank you, Sylvia, and Jim, and Mr. Martin for allowing us to have this day to speak, as we have waited, I think, way too long. Thank you.
Thank you, and your pictures are accepted for the record as an exhibit. Avis Mickelson?
I just let him talk.
You let him speak. Kathy Donat?
She left.
Dixie Robertson?
Oh, she was on. I was out of town.
John Zymat? Who's on the panel earlier. Rob Harrison? Rob Harrison? Lucy Martin? Lucy Martin?
Oh, she's left. I read her letter earlier.
You read her letter into the record earlier. Okay.
I am going to submit these papers. She's left.
That's Rosie's letter.
No, I've already submitted that. This is a copy of the settlement.
Ma'am, your name again?
Dixie Robertson.
Then you need to, you've stated your name for the record, you need to state that you're submitting
I
for
submitted.
the record,
I
into the
submitted.
record.
My name's Dixie Robertson, and I just submitted copies of my MRL settlement papers.
Once again, Sandra Tosi, Mayor of Alberton.
She left.
She left. Russell Gabelt. Please go ahead.
My name is Russell Gable. I live in Alberton, Montana. I got a picture of a doorknob here that I took right after I got back from evacuation. And anything that can do that to a brass doorknob sure can't be very good for people. The meaning of this hearing is to find out whether the EPA did their job. Is that correct? How deep was that excavation? I'm asking you. How deep was that excavation?
That's what we're trying to establish.
How come the EPA doesn't know that?
Well, I think earlier testimony indicated EPA was not in the hot zone for the first 3 to 4 days of the incident.
How come?
That's what we're trying to establish.
Well, if the EPA didn't know how deep the hole is that was supposed to clean up the mess, they obviously weren't doing their job, the way I see it. That's all I got. There's the picture.
Thank you. It'll be accepted for the record. Been asked if Heather Simmons wishes to speak on behalf of her family.
I'm loud now.
Pardon?
Go way down.
Heather, Heather?
Yeah.
I'm asking if you would come up and speak on behalf of your parents, tell us what's happened to
I
them.
said, I can do that. I'm like, I don't know my name now. And it's
Thank you.
Lausch, it's not Simmons, L-A-U-S. I know. Sure, so. major knee reconstructive surgery, and because of all the lung damage he's had, he's having a very hard time recouping from it. He also gets very claustrophobic when he's in an enclosed room with a lot of people. They've had, my mom was in perfect health before this happened, and she's had a lot of problems just that come up out of the blue that they can't explain. I don't know what else to.
Talk about your nieces and nephews' illnesses.
I don't know where all this came from. My nephew's had ear infections. He had tubes in his ears which fell out, but his ears never healed properly. He has problems hearing now. My niece has asthma, which seems to be ongoing and getting worse. I don't know too much. There's an outside person with that. I don't know the details.
I would like you to state your parents' full names for the record.
Russell and Sandra Simmons.
Thank you. Well, that concludes the list of folks who have signed up.
Excuse me, I thought I was on the list to speak. Did I sign the wrong list?
Well, if you wish to speak, please come forward. We're glad to hear you.
This one's not.
I must have signed the wrong list. My name is Robbie Flynn. And I live
I'm
in
sorry, could you
Missoula
say that
now.
again?
Robbie, R-O-B-I-E, Flynn, F-L-I-N-A. And I've been home maybe half a dozen times in the last 4 years. And I didn't go back after the derailment until September. And so I went out to help get some trees that had fallen down, and we were going to log them or do something with them. And that night I woke up and I had a metallic taste in my mouth, and I had something rattling around in my brain. It just went all the way around, and it just persisted. And so I don't think I went back for maybe another year. My clothes rotted. Everything I had was, basically there. When they started having the meetings in Missoula, I'm really susceptible to start with because I have asthma. I just had developed it before that. And everybody in all those rooms had all those clothes on, and they didn't need to have a counter or something out in Alberton. They could have put it right in those rooms, and we would have had every test you wanted right there. But I remember everybody said there was a no detect. And so finally I asked, and there was this panel, and so I asked a question because they were more or less telling everybody there, hey, none of our machines showed anything. You have to be wrong. So I asked Chris Weiss, and I said, well, which is right? Which would you trust, a machine or your nose? And he said, if you can smell it, trust your nose. And yet all through that, they kept saying, no detect. And then, let's see, I even had, once I took 6 kids down, I think all under, from the age of about 11 to 16, down to one of the senator's office. And his receptionist didn't want us in there, didn't want anything, and I said, this is how our government works. And so I did manage to get her to get the head EPA guy in the state on the line. And he basically told those kids all their parents were not doing well, and I forget their parents' names right now, but that's an Alberton syndrome. And the guy in Helena told the kids, there's nobody sick in Alberton. Not one person has called in and said, I'm sick. And he said, there's nothing wrong in Alberton. And one 13-year-old said, well, are you calling my dad a liar? And he says, yes, I am. Nobody's sick in Alberton. And that was a great example for all those kids. Of course, their lives have changed. But And so, you know, I've more or less stayed current on everything that's going on, even though I don't live there. I won't go in to vote, I won't do anything there. But, and I was in it for the long haul, and I've got a lot of major problems that I think because I was susceptible, they're even worse. I mean, I've lost my teeth, good God, you know, and I have holes in my bones and everything, which is, you know, what they predicted, you know, there were going to be certain things, and those were some of them, and we just live with it. My eyes have watered for 4.5 years. In fact, I just went Monday, and my doctor said, well, put some more eye drops in your eyes. Well, that's for the rest of my life. But this spring, when we're all expecting, you know, we're going to do everything, it was a real challenge getting our attorneys to do anything. And most of the time they would say, you know, why don't you just get on your life and leave us alone so that we can do this? And so last spring they called us all in one by one and said, you know, we decided you don't have a case, none of you have a case. So we're going to tell you, now you accept this or we're going to drop you. Okay, the filing time is passed. There's no attorney that will take anybody after 4 years. And they knew that. So they said, you know, you could either take your file and walk out or you take what we say you're going to get. So we have no choice. We have nobody to go to. Now, just before this meeting was announced, and I don't know, you know, too many coincidences, they called everybody in and they gave us some more money. And said, oh, here, this is the early Christmas present, whatever. I don't see any of the people from this attorney testifying here. Everything that they've done is to take our testimony and say that it's invalid, that we are invalid, that there's nothing wrong, you know. They won't even say it's in our head because we know it's in our head. But, you know, it's just too many things have gone on all the way through. I used to, before I moved to Missoula, I worked for major airlines and I handled tariffs and for airlines and overfly rights and different things. And believe me, if you go from one country to another, you better show your manifest and you better have your prices out there too. And I also did tariffs for interstate within the United States. And I know anytime you cross lines, you have to have a tariff, you have to have a manifest. Where was the manifest? Why did nobody ever say, this is you have to file this manifest with the Transportation Board of Washington, D.C. And this is available for the public. Do we have to wait 25 years until finally we get the Freedom of the Act or whatever to find out what was on the manifest? I mean, what's wrong with finding a manifest? I mean, isn't this part interstate transportation? You're supposed to show what's on the train. And we also have a free zone here in Missoula. There's just all these things that went along that, you know, that have been done to the people in Alberton, the people who drove through, the people who were in Missoula where they parked the trains, everything. Nobody has had, we haven't had good doctors. You know, I mentioned my eyes water, and my doctor said more eye drops. After 4.5 years, you know, I think maybe the doctors should be a little less afraid of the fact that they're dealing with people from Alberton. But they still won't treat us. And he said, well, go somewhere else. When I got Dr. Kilburn's test, I had like 6, 7 of these things. And my attorney says, you're free to go anywhere you want. Well, I'm sorry. We may have above normal education in Alberton, but we're the 50th in the whole nation. We are a poverty area. Sure, you're going to tell people from Alberton, go find some neurolog, you know, some brain guy and get fixed? Where? And so these people, you know, all of us needed money to get the test and everything 4.5 years ago. Right now, you know, so there aren't, you know, I just don't see very many people here that should have been here. But I'm sort of out of it because my attorney screwed us and sold us down the road. And there's maybe people driving around Alberton with some new cars, but we were forced into doing it and we got pennies. Not enough to take care of any serious health problems or anything. And let's see, what else? I just think the whole thing stinks of corruption. And I don't know where anybody wants to start, but 4.5 years later, thank you for coming, Robert. Thank you. Any questions?
Can we stop one minute? I just got out of paper here.
We're off the record just for a moment.
That's not the record, that's the
Oh, sorry.
Okay, we're back on the record. I understand there are several people who are present who did not wind up on the list, but nonetheless wish to speak. Start with you. Please state your name for the record.
My name is Robertson. I'm a student at the Alberton High School, and for the last 4 years, when it's hot outside in the spring, we can smell, and other students in my school can smell chemicals like chlorine and other stuff coming out of the carpets. And the playground equipment, when we came back, was rusted and everything. And the wood chips that were on the playground still haven't been replaced on there. And I was just wanting to state that there obviously wasn't any cleanup or anything in the schools. And also, since the chlorine spill, I have asthma, and pretty much my rescue inhaler was off the medication I was taking. I only had to take that maybe once or twice a week. Now I am on 6 different pill medications and 2 inhalers. I have a nebulizer. And I do sports, but usually I was getting sick because of my asthma, and football and basketball and stuff. I might be able to play 7 or 8 games out of the whole season because I have
Hi, my name is Giles. For the record, some of the audience was curious about victims' symptoms, so I thought I would list that publicly. My symptoms include memory loss, joint pain, migraine headaches every 2 to 3 days, heartburn, trembling of the hands, and eye sensitivities, chronic fatigue, the chest pain that they can't figure out, chemical sensitivities that include sensitivities to odors, which also includes smells that can be perfume, cleaning products, fertilizers, even a tire shop or walking through a department store will set off a dizziness that can also turn into migraine headaches. I also have a ringing in my ears. Some information that I thought might be interesting about the white dust. We didn't find any white dust at our house, but some people have speculated that it may be caused from the transient winds blowing soda ash or lime through the air. And I would like to mention that I highly doubt that it was the soda ash, because MRL ordered a truckload of soda ash for the cleanup site that they never used. The reason I know this is because they ordered it from the company that I work for. They called us back, asked if they could return this whole truckload of soda ash, which by the way is used to neutralize acids. And it was my job to go inspect the soda ash to see indeed if we could take it back. And I discovered that it was soaked with rain and had hardened like to mention the carelessness of MRL's handling the waste soil. I would like to also mention that I submitted a video that shows MRL's handling of the waste soil, proving that they did not put placards on the cars, that they were not properly labeled. And also, several people witnessed truckloads of waste soil being trucked down the interstate with tarps flapping in the breeze. Again, it did not follow any of the Department of Transportation requirements for the handling of this toxic waste. I would also like to request that soil tests be made in my area along Southside Road, the same area that Larry Mickelson was talking about, not only because of the cars that were sidetracked near our area, but because we were told by volunteer fire department men that there was a persistent cloud that hung in that area for days. And I would recommend that would be a good place to test. I know that after we were allowed to come home that first year, every time we mowed the lawn, the whole family would have reoccurring symptoms, which include dizziness, upset stomach, vision impurities, and sore throats. So there must be something there more than just simply chlorine. I'd also like to mention that I was exposed a second time at Petty Creek. This was close to the railroad siding where they parked those toxic waste cars. My son and I were down at the Petty Creek Bridge the evening of May 18th at 7 o'clock, marking the high water levels because of all the rain that we'd seen. And we pulled into the boat ramp, and I got out and walked down to the water's edge to check the stick that we put in the mud. And at that point, I didn't know that there were sidecars real close to that area. But when I got down to the water's edge, checked the water level, I kneeled down and immediately was overcome by strong chemical odors. So strong, in fact, that they collapsed me to my knees and felt like a vice on my head. I lost all my motor skills, and my son, who was still up in the car, yelled, "Dad, are you okay?" At that point, I yelled back, "No, stay where you are." And I had to just tell myself, okay, get up on your knees, get up on your feet, and walk back to the car and leave. I felt instantly nauseated and headache, dizzy, and a real strong ringing in my ears. And I concluded that the reason that hit me at that point was because I knelt down close to the water surface where the heavy gases from the chemicals from those sidecar rail cars had in fact dropped to the lowest point, which was the water level. And that was where my head was. We made it back to the house, and my son told my wife what had happened. I was sitting on the couch with an extreme migraine headache and pressure, and when she came in the house, she found me collapsed on the kitchen floor because I was trying to make my way to the kitchen sink, feeling like I was going to throw up. A couple days later, I went to the emergency room with this persistent migraine headache and got some relief, but ever since then, I've had migraine headaches every 2 to 3 days. I've been to 4 different neurologists, several neuropathic type doctors, and I take a handful of vitamins, herbs, that we would be supplied with additional medical testing for myself and my family to find out in truth why we are having these problems. I guess that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. I have several other names, and I would favor among those names witnesses who have had direct experiences with the incident. Roxanne Zymak, Parris Young,
Parris Young, P-A-R-R-I-S. I didn't really sign the list, but someone did for me, and I do have a few things to say. We were located like 2.5 miles to the west of the actual spill. The prevailing winds blow out of the west, but every night the winds stop and go the other way. So the chemistry acted in a way unusual. It blew uphill first, up the drainages, then when the wind stopped, it came back. So it actually rocked back and forth in the valley quite a bit, like a big pool. I wasn't evacuated. I spent the first day on the telephone phoning my neighbors to find out how bad it was, even though I was close. And I could smell it in the evening of the first day, about like a hot tub. So I didn't think it was that serious. All I heard on the radio was chlorine. And I thought a little bit, no worse than a hot tub wouldn't do me any harm. But it was persistent. A few days later, a few friends came out and got me. It just happened to be that during that period of time, both my cars were broken down. I was waiting for a piece from Missoula. I couldn't evacuate myself. So that's a little sloppy. I think in the future it would be probably good to evacuate a larger area than, I don't know how you would draw such a line, actually. But my neighbors were affected, and so was I. The smell was so persistent that although I stayed in Missoula a year afterwards, I went out with Robbie sometime to process the logs that had blown down in the December 95 windstorm. And we could smell like clouds of it going back and forth. And not strictly chlorine, but the other, like at least 2 other chemicals we could smell. And the other thing I wanted to say was the attitude of industry toward the testimony of citizens is less than honorable, I believe. They tend to shrug off our testimony like it was word of mouth, hearsay, or anecdotal evidence. And it's none of that. It's testimony. And as soon as people give a listen, all of a sudden you're able to delimit some symptoms. And actually, that's part of clinical observation, is what people see. If you take enough of them, and I think we have enough here to actually come up with some meaningful descriptions of what actually, the chemicals that actually took place. I'm not in a hurry to affix blame to anybody, although I think MRL was a little brusque with their treatment, and some of their industrial physicians were actually insulting to Dixie Sandstrom and other people. Callous is the word that springs to mind. But most of the other disagreements, I think, are people only perceive a certain order and certain details, and most of the differences that people talk about are differences of order of perception. I really appreciate the chance and the opportunity you gave the community to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Kathy Finneman.
I have a written statement that I just have to submit pictures, mine and my children's.
I think you need to speak more directly into the microphone. Thank you.
I have a written statement that I'd like to submit pictures on behalf of myself and my children.
And we also have one from Fran Hayes.
From a friend.
Fran.
Fran Hayes, thank you.
So accepted. Ada Chalmers?
I just wanted to take this opportunity to publicly thank you for coming out and during this afternoon. Thank you.
Welcome. Hope Sieck.
My name's Hope Sieck, S-I-E-C-K.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you. My name's Hope Sieck, S-I-E-C-K. And I lived in Missoula at the time of this bill and went to many of the evacuees meetings starting on April 13th, during which time I observed people with physical symptoms, chemical burns on their faces to their eyes, and chemical smells emanating from their clothing in the meetings because proper decontamination had occurred. Immediately following re-entry, I and some other people, including Tony Tweedale and Darrell Geist and Jim Parker, all from Missoula, went out to Alberton to meet with some of the evacuees who had returned home. And we all experienced symptoms, smelled chemicals, got headaches, experienced kind of spaciness, short-term memory loss, dizziness, just a general feeling like we were slightly intoxicated when we went out to Alberton and went into people's homes where there were carpets or draperies with chemicals in it. Another thing that should be on the record is that this same experience held true for a lot of people visiting Alberton. People who weren't initially exposed but came to visit family or friends in Alberton would become sick. So the case for the lingering exposure and impacts from other chemicals besides chlorine, I think, is quite clear. So I just want to enter some things into the record and make a couple of quick points. First of all, as far as EPA's responsibility in this, we kept hearing that more testing would be time-consuming and expensive. This whole experience for every person who was exposed in Alberton has been time-consuming for 4.5 years and very expensive, not only financially, but to their health, to their lives, to their emotionally. So I don't really accept that doing a final round of sampling to establish what people are exposed to is impossible or too time-consuming or too expensive for EPA to undertake. The reason we're here today is because they didn't do their job 4.5 years ago. And throughout this, people's bodies have led the inquiry by EPA. Starting at the very beginning, residents were allowed to return to the site on April 13th. They started experiencing symptoms that weren't attributable to chlorine, and that's the only thing that led the agencies to start exploring and testing for other things besides chlorine. And again, people are still sick, so that's what keeps driving this whole process. Instead of the agencies doing proactive investigative sampling to tell people what they were exposed to and to prevent these sorts of long-term health symptoms. So what people are really asking here for and what should happen is a full site characterization with all of the available information to be used to extrapolate backwards to tell people for once and for all what they were exposed to, what types of health effects they are experiencing and can expect to experience, and what they can do about those health effects. It's very simple questions that should have been answered in the weeks right after this derailment that weren't answered. And in fact, people have been asking for the same thing for these past 4.5 years, and I appreciate the Ombudsman's investigation to finally get to the bottom of this, because it's exacted a huge toll on all of these people. So I want to enter into the record a timeline showing that EPA did not enter the site until 4 days after the spill, during which time the railroad company took control of the site and allowed its own contractors to be doing all of the testing, which was only for chlorine. There's that. And then documentation from the public record of EPA's not being on site So, should I just light this on? Okay. A timeline of Olympus Environmental's activities on site, which before EPA got there, they were only doing pH testing, weren't looking to see what other chemicals were. There's that. And I think a point that deserves to be re-stressed is that before any chemicals have been tested for, besides chlorine, the incident command with EPA's rubber stamp of approval allowed people to return back onto the site on April 13th on the so-called pet rescues, during which a lot of initial exposure happened. I also want to enter the re-entry allowable criteria. There were 4 criteria: chlorine gas, chlorinated compounds, potassium cressolate, and white dust. Only 1 out of the 4, in my opinion, was ever actually answered before they allowed people to re-enter. I want to enter from the log the description of the pet rescues on April 14th, in which they see that everyone seems satisfied with the process, which I think other testimony will contradict. Also, I want to enter from the record, dated April 21st, 1996, that there was 13 parts per million trichlorophenol red in the air near the tracks, which contradicts some of the Olympus environmental reports that there weren't ever organic materials detected in the air. A letter to EPA outlining what full site characterization would be comprised of, according to the community, which bears on this next round of sampling. The list that was provided to evacuees by Incident Command on health and environmental information for people, entitled Health and Environmental Information for People Returning to Alberton, in which they were told that the other chemicals were of no concern, and the only symptoms they would be experiencing would be short-term eye, nose, throat, airway, and lung irritation that would resolve over time. And this is what everyone based their return on, is this type of assurance that now we know is completely false. And a list of reported symptoms versus expected symptoms, as people were told. Classic chlorine symptoms versus potassium cressolate, phenolic symptoms versus the actual symptoms which people are experiencing, the list of which far exceeds the sum of any of the expected symptoms. And finally, the comments of Stuart Levitt, who couldn't be here today. So thank you, and I look forward to resolution of this for once and for all, as to what actually happened on site and to the victims of the spill. Thank you.
Thank you. Missoula City Council Member Glenda Crowley.
Glenda Crowley, and I serve on the Missoula City Council. I didn't come prepared with a statement today. I came here to support the people of Alberton that I knew. But after hearing the testimony, it brought back the horror of the spill, and I felt like I needed to at least make a statement. First of all, I want to apologize for the fact that our health director, our chief of police, and our fire chief did not come today. I will be checking with them about that. For me, the Alberton spill, and as a resident of Missoula, the Alberton spill brought home the fact that Missoula was so extremely vulnerable to the same kind of accident. And we had over 50,000 people, and we only have 2 or 3 ways out of town. So I became interested, I became driven to make sure that if that ever happened in Missoula, people in Missoula would be prepared. So as a city council person, I volunteered to be on the local emergency planning committee. That's where I met Hope Sieck. And I started to learn about some of the facts of the Alberton spill. Because up until then, I was only learning what was in the paper or on TV. And we tried We tried to start something through our Right to Know committee that would expand the Right to Know committee's ability to make MRL more responsive and more forthcoming about what was going through our town and how it was being handled. But after a few months, it became pretty evident that the folks on the LEPC had a great deal of disinterest in that. And for many reasons. MRL has a strong presence in our town, in our state. But also responders, the folks who go to the hazardous incident, they are trained and they are focused on responding. They're not focused on prevention. And that's what we wanted to do. So along with many of the people that I had met from Alberton and people in Missoula, we created a resolution to create a hazardous materials transportation task force that would focus on prevention, awareness, preparedness, and public pressure on transporters of hazardous materials. The City Council passed that a few months ago, and in fact, the county has now said that it will be a joint city-county resolution. Just wanted to let you know that, and I wanted to say that I'm grateful to people like Mr. Chalmers, Lucinda Hodges, and all the other people from Alberton that have not let more powerful voices keep their voices down.
Thank you. Darrell, Geist with Called Out and Called Rivers.
I won't be as long as it appears to be. I promise. Aren't you going to read all that? No. No. I read it last night. Last one. For the record, my name is Darrell Geist. I'm Executive Director of Cool Mountain and Cold Rivers. We're a nonprofit environmental and human rights group based here in Missoula. And before I get to our role in this affair, I just want to give you a little bit of brief synopsis of my experience of the train derailment chemical spill. I was not here the morning of the spill. I returned from Elk Bend, Hot Springs, Idaho, approximately 3 days after the spill itself. And I was approximately 20, 25 miles south of Missoula in the Bitterroot Valley, and I was overcome by a very toxic smell. And my recollection of it was that I thought it was the pulp mill, that some accident had occurred at the facility. And I became ill, and for the next few days I exhibited flu-like symptoms, and I didn't find out until later that day that in fact Montana railing train had derailed, and there was a catastrophic spill of toxic chemicals in the canyon. As far as Coal Mountain and Coal River's role has been, we've assisted in the research and investigation of the accident to seek disclosure of the public health impacts, of the extent and level of environmental contamination, and also to support to the Albertson community and the citizens group and the folks that have led the effort to seek disclosure of the truth, and also to seek justice for the people who were affected in this terrible incident. I do have some documentation today to submit for the record. First bit of evidence is a VHS tape of aerial footage shot by KPAX of Albertson, Montana, 4/11/96. It's of the Montana railing train derailment, chemical spill. It's about 2.5 minutes of tape. That's my first submission. It speaks for itself. So accepted. The second piece of evidence is a media report filed from various sources. The only thing I will draw attention to in this media report is the fact that very little known fact that chlorine that spilled in Alberton was produced by Georgia Pacific West out of Bellingham, Washington, and it was found for 2 Georgia Pacific pulp mill facilities. One of them in Crossett, Arkansas, and the other in Port Hudson, Louisiana. And that information was verified by Georgia Pacific shortly after the accident, and also by further evidence in the train manifest itself. The little known fact that chlorine that so affected people's health was produced and intended to make nice white paper. In our investigation of the spill, we felt that there was a total failure on the part of Montana Railing to provide timely and accurate information that jeopardized people's health, not only of the residents, the evacuees, but the emergency responders themselves. We did review, it was difficult to get information. The information we did review officially was in Missoula City County Clerk and Recorder's files here in Missoula. And just a couple notes on that. Information in these files that we copied from research, it doesn't log the dates on when the information was received, who it was received by, who it was distributed to, and how it was disclosed to the public. Time and time again, the information that is presented here in these files that supposedly meet the requirements of EPA, Emergency Planning Community Rights No Act, there's no timeline, there's no real solid information about how that information was circulated to the emergency responders and the people who were evacuated from the community. And just one little, bring a couple notes here. 2 different sources. Jan Butz, the sheriff's office. She does not have a log of dates which would show when particular files came in. That's the second piece of evidence I would enter. Another note from Mike Estat, Missoula City County Attorney, 6/25/96. Vital information was lost. Nobody had a time date stamp at the site. The 2 sources of information, the so-called official record, confirming what we knew, was that we don't know who got what, when, where, and how it was distributed to the public. We still don't know to this day. Based on the lack of that documentation, our organization did file a notice of intent to sue Montana Railing for violations of EPA. We have not filed a formal complaint on that notice for a couple of reasons, and one of them is lack of resources. Our organization is small. And the second one, more importantly, is the fact that even we did an analysis, we found that even if we were successful under EPA in getting disclosure, that the disclosure itself may not be successful in terms of trying to find out what people were really exposed to, because we're still trying to find that information out. So we felt that even if we were successful in our lawsuit, that, there may not have been full disclosure of the toxic chemicals formed or released on that site. And all liquid are still there. So we have our EPA notice and response from Montana Railing. I'd like to submit it to the record. And as an aside on this issue, I want to treat this very carefully because it's still a confidential communication I had. But I can say that I was contacted by an emergency responder who was concerned about the kinds of information that was being given, provided to the emergency responders on the site. Can't say any more than that. I'm still trying to track this individual down to get disclosure of what was given to me. We did some further researching at the Burns database, it's the emergency response notification system, to find out where Montana Railing was also having derailments and spills of hazardous materials. And we're going to enter that as well as a document. It's essentially from 12/18/88 through 4/11/96. It's a database search. It prints out 17 reported incidents of Montana Railing train derailments and or hazardous chemical releases. There is a memorandum I'd also like to enter into the record. It's by a man named John Cartwright. He's a track specialist. And the subject is Montana Railing. It's a rail assessment. It's dated June 10th, 1996. And to summarize his assessment, and it's a draft. Federal Railroad inspectors conducted a special investigation of MRL from April 28th through May 3rd, 1996, which was, quote, prompted by several track-caused derailments attributed to failed rails, unquote. Briefly, MRL accident history. During the period January 1, 1991 to December 31st, 1995, there were 28 track-caused derailments of the Montana Rail Lincoln Line. April 1996, 21 additional derailments occurred on the MRL, 8 of which were track-caused. Investigation results. 33 curves were identified by special investigators which did not meet MRL's guidelines. The MRL, in some cases, had not measured curves for wear at points throughout the entire curve. At a time when MRL was planning for reduced rail traffic, gross annual tonnage increased approximately 20%, which, quote, accelerated curve wear to the extent that numerous curves reached the MRL limits for relaning sooner than had been projected. During 1995, a total of 553 defective rails were detected by spare rail service detected cars. And that's a summary of that memo, which I'm also going to enter into the record. So based on what we were finding in the public record, some of the Alberton folks and our organization worked together. We came up with a petition for the prevention of railroad accidents and the catastrophic release of chemicals that these accidents cause. We have this on our website. I'd like to enter that into the record as well. And briefly, just to draw the importance to it, you know, we look at the Alberton chemical spill as incredibly catastrophic. And we look at some of the facts, and this 25,000 hazardous waste-filled rail cars passing through Montana each year. It's 25,000. And there's a lot of laws that exempt rail transporters. They're exempt from EPA unless there's an accident involving the release of a reportable quantity of chemicals. They're exempt from the risk management program to identify the potentials for chemical accidents, and to work with emergency responders, develop emergency response plans for derailments and chemical accidents. It's 40 CFR Part 68. It goes on. Railroad transporters are pretty much exempt from many laws that fix facilities are not. I want to submit a memo from Hope Sieck. She's a former member of the LEPC Rights and Notice Subcommittee, and kind of echoes Luann's comments. And essentially, the memo recommends disclosure of hazardous materials being transported by MRL through the county. It advises severe case transportation hazard analysis to reflect the derailment on the scale of the April 11th, 1996 incident in Alberton, Montana. filing to publicize an evacuation plan for the city and the county based on a severe case incident. That as well, that's on the record. Quickly, there's 2 letters here from the Alberton Community Coalition for Environmental Health. One to EPA Director Carol Bronner, asking her to rectify misinformation that exists in the public record and to uphold the EPA's mission to protect human health and to safeguard our natural environment. The second letter is the Environmental Control Council, underscoring Montana Department of Environmental Quality failures to respond to citizen complaints in a similar fashion to corporate complaints being filed with their office, and highlighting a double standard that exists at the state level, Department of Environmental Quality. Finally, and somehow we're getting this in some detail because I was a party to it. Montana Department of Environmental Quality there was a series of conversations I had with officials, and I took copious notes, all dealing essentially with the cleanup of the site. My first conversation was with Tom Norhoff, the Montana DEQ, on 5/14/1996, and I was trying to determine information about how piles of contaminated material were being separated on site and how it's being disposed of. Well, in the course of my conversations with not only Tom Norhoff, but with the DEQ Waste Management Program, the hazardous waste section on the DEQ down the Dream, and John Dillard, I found out that individuals in this office in DEQ had conflicting information about which pile was hazardous, which pile was clean, and which pile was being designated solid waste in BFI's landfill. And so based on this conflicting information, we did make a request to make an unannounced test sampling of material being directed at the BFI facility. I'm going to grab my notes. They did, in fact, sorry, go ahead.
When you were talking to these people at DEQ, had any of them actually been to the site and looked at the piles?
That's one of my questions I asked them. It was vague. The response was vague. All I can tell you, I mean, based on my notes and my recollection of the events, Montana DEQ's role in their oversight of the cleanup was inept. It was incompetent. And they essentially left it up to the PRP, the party responsible